Hello everyone, today we're just going to do a quick 25 marker from an Edexcel Paper 3. This is for A-Level Economics. And the question is, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a depreciation of the pound. Refer to restaurants or other food industry services in your answer. So like always, I'm doing two big topic areas. Each of those is going to have two paragraphs, an analysis paragraph and an evaluation paragraph that's specific to the point that I'm making. And normally with these paper 3 questions where it's microeconomics and macroeconomics, I'm going to pick my first topic to be micro, my second topic to be macro, just to be super clear that I'm answering the question fully. So with topic A, for the microeconomic side, we're looking at how the higher cost of imports is going to hurt the finances of businesses. So microeconomics, because we're focused on the individual businesses. And for topic B, it's going to be the risk of cost push inflation, which is our macroeconomics topic. So for the first topic, for increasing the cost of imports, by the way, I do a quick intro, and that quick intro would probably be just a definition of what depreciation is, and then move quickly into analysis. You don't need a super long introduction. There's not a ton in the extracts that's super helpful to us. I have picked out that I want to include this predicted 20% fall in the external value of the pound. Whenever there's a number in the extracts, I like to use the number. Generally goes down a bit better than just referencing the ideas in the extracts. So for the analysis here, the argument is basically that the depreciation of the pound means that it's going to be more expensive to import goods. And the reason for that is at some point between a restaurant in the UK selling a dish to a British person who pays in pounds and, some vegetable farmer in a foreign country being paid in their local currency, at some point along that chain of transactions, someone has to convert the currency. And if the pound has depreciated, you still have to pay wages at the same level in the local currency of the places that you're importing from, right? So the costs really haven't changed in local currency abroad, and that means that you're going to have to spend more pounds generally to be able to purchase the same goods if the pound has become weaker. So this means that it's going to be more expensive to import goods, and that's going to increase costs for businesses that use those goods as inputs. So the example here would be like the increased costs of imported goods like parmesan. So I'm trying to keep it stick to the restaurant example. Restaurants use lots of imported goods like fruits, vegetables, parmesan, right? Like most fruit is not grown in the UK. Most sort of cheese and meats is not produced in the UK. Beef is imported from Brazil, for example. And that means a lot of the costs that businesses have, a lot of the costs that restaurants have, are imported goods. This in turn will either reduce the profit margins of those businesses because they just decide to pay more but not raise prices for consumers, or they do decide to raise prices for consumers, in which case you have like an effect on the consumers, and potentially you drive down the amount of people who are shopping at your business. So the second sort of follow-on I've put here is to talk about how restaurants are a low margin industry and sort of explain why that's the case. So restaurants tend to be very competitive because there's a lower barrier to entry. It's much easier to set up a restaurant than it is to start a pharmaceutical company or go into high-tech manufacturing or build cars. So generally, compared to other industries, restaurants, there's going to be lots of them in a city, and they tend to be more price competitive, which might result in firms being less willing to push those costs onto consumers, but it also puts them in a position where they're starting out with very low profit margins. So there's also not masses of headroom in terms of their ability to just eat the costs, because it's much easier just to eat the cost of increased import prices if you're a business that has large margins to begin with. Restaurants are not in that position. For the diagram, it's just fairly straightforward supply and demand diagram. So because of the cost of input goods, that's going to generally reduce the willingness to produce at certain price levels. So that's a leftward shift in the supply curve, which gives us this higher equilibrium point where supply intersects with demand. So you can see the rise in price from P to P dash, and also the reduction in the quantity demanded from Q to Q dash. So just be using this throughout the explanation for basically why you're likely to see reduced demand in the restaurant industry, why you're going to see fewer sales. In terms of the evaluation, the way I'm going to use the evaluation for this point is to basically try and point out some conditions in the market that might affect what happens, right? So I've said, we're going to push these costs onto consumers. But one point I might make in an evaluation is to say, well, this depends on price elasticity. So if you're in a position where you've got more price elastic demand, you might try and keep prices low than risk losing the customers. You might have some restaurants where people have a really strong preference for eating at that restaurant, and so you don't need, you can afford to put your prices up a little bit more. Those consumers aren't necessarily going to go away. Other types of restaurants might be way more price competitive. So that might be, market to market, even within restaurants. You could talk also about price elasticity demand is likely to be influenced by the local incomes, right? So if you're in a wealthier area, people maybe will be willing to put up with higher prices if they like your product, whereas in other areas, not so much. The other factor here might be if you see that this is potentially a short-term change in the exchange rate, a shock, it's possible that firms really won't change their behavior. You're not going to change prices. It's possible even that exporters give importers a bit of leeway if they think prices are going to change a lot in terms of the exchange rate, if they think it's going to return to normal fairly quickly. You're much more likely to see changes to the industry if it's likely those exchange rates stick around for a longer period of time. You get lots of cases like, with the Truss government, for example, where there's a shock to the pound loses a lot of value, but then it bounces back pretty quickly because it was really more of a panic about something happening and less of materially the exchange rate needs to be lower. The second topic is more macro focused. So we're talking about inflation generally. And the context here from the extracts is that we've had these minimum wage increases, right? So there's a 2.2% increase in 2021 and a 6.2% increase in 2020. The explanation here is when you have this increase in the cost of imports, which you already explained in the previous point, this is going to increase the variable production costs for businesses across industries. So this is not just something that happens with restaurants, it's something that is happening in other markets as well, which gives us this leftward shift in aggregate supply, and you get a higher overall price level. Again, I've got this point about businesses making this decision to eat costs or pass it on to consumers. I would not keep making this point over and over again, so I've just kind of left it in because there's lots of different places you could put this, but I wouldn't use it as like an evaluation and analysis in two of your topics, right? You don't need to say it 3 times, but there's plenty of other things we can say. The wage price spiral point, I'm really bringing this in because the extracts are very focused on minimum wage because that's the other question. I want to use the extracts for the application, so I'm going to kind of add in this point that maybe naturally I wouldn't always make, and that's the risk of a wage price spiral. So given that we are already in a position where wages have been going up, the minimum wage has been being increased, that's already pro-inflationary. That means that it's even more likely that the rising costs of imports will trigger an inflationary spiral because you have 2 different things in the economy that are both pro-inflationary. And also, once you get into that inflationary spiral, you get higher wage demands as prices go up. People go to their employers and they want their wages to keep up with inflation. Maybe they want their wages to exceed inflation. And so this is also pro-inflationary. So you get into this position where the price of imports are going up and also people want more wages, and you get into kind of a loop where prices just go higher and higher and higher. And we can bring in our cost push inflation diagram. Again, you've got the leftward shift in aggregate supply leading to an increase in the price level. I mean, this looks very, very similar to the previous diagram. This is just macro instead of micro, so the analysis is kind of similar. We get the leftward shift. This is overall reducing the prices of goods in the economy if nothing changes in terms of aggregate demand. In terms of an evaluation down here, I've pointed out first and foremost that there might be a time delay before firms pass goods on to consumers. So again, we're kind of tying into this same idea we were talking about earlier, where like if this is a short-term phenomenon, maybe things don't change as much. The real reason there's going to be a big time delay in this case is if firms are deciding not to pass prices on to consumers, but instead to eat into their profit margin. especially for businesses like restaurants, which we should keep bringing this back to, where they have small margins. You can do that for a short period of time, but eventually you're forced to put up prices. So there's going to be a period maybe where businesses resist increasing prices, and then you suddenly get a moment where a lot of them just have to put up prices roughly at the same time, and so you get a delay in when you get the inflationary effect. Also pointing out that this depends on demand side conditions. So here I've drawn the ASAD diagram like aggregate demand is just staying the same. But if you had like a decrease in aggregate demand that came at the same time, that would reduce the pressure on the price level. Like the price level may not go up, or it may go up by less. Basically what this means is if you're in a market maybe where you have a negative output gap, where you're in a recession where people have other reasons to be hesitant about spending lots of money, then you're much more likely to get an outcome where there's not as much inflation, just because the prices are going up, but people aren't really buying that many goods anyway. So there's not really a big difference in like the spending behavior. There's not necessarily like the fact that people are generally unwilling to purchase goods is going to make firms even more resistant to putting up prices. So you're just a lot less likely to get the inflationary effect as a result if aggregate demand or demand side stuff is lower. You could also have other kind of government responses. So if there's like the pro-inflationary pressure, you might get, for example, like increases to interest rates in an effort to reduce demand, reductions in government spending, tax increases, if the government's really concerned about inflation. That's also something you could bring up in your analysis and evaluation. The last part of this would be some kind of conclusion. Here it's not so much a case of either topic A or topic B. Like a lot of the time with the first two papers in Edexcel, I will have talked about two different policies and I'll say which one I think is best. Not really how I would do conclusions on paper 3, because most of the time you're talking about similar effects, but you're talking about them for micro and then for macro. The way I would probably do this is I would discuss this point about whether or not firms in the restaurant industry are likely to put up prices, and come back to that in the conclusion. And if I think they're less likely to put up prices, then we say, okay, well, there's not as much risk of inflation. Maybe this doesn't have as big an effect on the economy as we've been talking about in this paper. So that's kind of how you come to a conclusion at the end for something like this. I hope this was helpful, and I would be curious to hear how you would answer a question like this.